Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting and crafting and making, share my tips, my tricks, my opinions, my preferences, my experiences, my experiments, all the good things of making pretty things, usually with pretty string. So something I've started hearing over the past 15, 20 years at this point really is you can learn everything free on the internet. You don't need to buy a book. You don't need to take a class. It's all for free on the internet. Just go to the internet and learn how to knit. And honestly, not a huge fan of that piece of advice. Don't get me wrong. I think people, if you are someone who is really good at doing your own research and being an autodidact, then that's great. Get on with your bad self. But I think for a lot of people, searching around the internet for information on how to knit and finding reliable sources that have like good illustrations or good video demonstrations can be really difficult. And I mean, look, I have a YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel that is all about sharing like my tips and tricks about knitting. But I'm gonna be honest, I still don't think it's a substitute for at least having one good general knitting reference book. And that's why I have 3. And I'm going to review them for you today. Reference books are actually my favorite type of knitting book because you get to learn in them. There's so much and they apply to almost anything. And you don't have to figure out the right search term to put into Google, and you don't have to figure out, is this a good resource? Is this a good article? Is this a good video to tell me about this knitting technique? Because the book has been edited by professionals for you. So hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up, and let's look at some general knitting reference books. As always, quick reminder, down in the description box you will find timestamps to different parts of the video. I always hope that you'll watch through the video at least one time. But if there's a specific book that you want to find out about or refresh your memory about, or just something specific you want to look at, there are timestamps down in the description box. Down in the description box, of course, you will also find links to the books that I'm going to discuss today, and these will have clearly marked affiliate links. If you click on one of these links, it'll take you to a place where you can do some shopping, and if you make a purchase, I might earn a small commission, which then does help support my channel. With that being said, I want to assure you that what I'm going to be reviewing today is absolutely 100% my honest opinion. So if you utilize one of my affiliate links, thank you so much. It's so greatly appreciated. And if you don't, totally get it. So cool. Really just glad that I could be a resource for you today. So there are 3 books that I'm going to review today. One is the Vogue Knitting, the Ultimate Knitting book. Then we have the Reader Digest Knitter's Handbook by Mott's Stanley. And then the third book, which is actually, I have an ebook format, which is Principles of Knitting by June Hyatt. All 3 of these books kind of cover what I consider like the breadth of basics in knitting, meaning that you learn about knitting your knits and purls, you learn about your basic increases, decreases, they all have several bind-offs, several cast-ons. You start learning intermediate skills like intarsia and cables and short rows. All 3 of these books cover how to read a pattern, whether it's written directions or charted directions. So almost anything that you would need to know in order to knit a basic sweater pattern pretty much is going to be covered in one of these books. All right, so that's what they all have in common. The other thing they all have in common is you will not find patterns in these books. These are books where it's really like, this pattern calls for me to do a lifted increase. What is that? Let me go look at my knitter's handbook and I can find out how to do a lifted increase. All right. What I think separates these books from one another and why you might choose one of these books over another, it really comes down to how comprehensive they are. Because like I said, some of them are more comprehensive than other, and the other has to do sort of in presentation of the information, and in tone. I feel like each one of these books, the tone in which they are written is a little bit different, and some might appeal to you more than others. If you are new to knitting, or consider yourself a more beginner knitter, no matter how many years you might be knitting, and ask me which one general reference book would you recommend, I would pick for you the Vogue Knitting, the Ultimate Knitting book. I really do love this book. I turn to it often when I want to kind of refresh myself on some basic skills, or I come across one that I haven't done in a while and I'm like, oh, let me just read up on that real quickly again. A lot of times this is the book that I grab, and part of the reason for that is it is so well organized, like so well organized. You can tell by the way that I've used this book extensively because I have all these flags here from various notes that I have made over time. If you're curious, part of the reason I have all these tags was when I was doing the level 1 master hand knitting class through the Knitting Guild. I use this as a resource quite often. But you look here in this first page and you have all your chapters, and I think that the order in which the information flows makes a lot of sense. But what's really nice is this color coding system. And so each chapter starts with a color-coded page, right? Here's this yellow page. This is knitting supplies, yarn, and tools. And it tells you right in that first page what you're going to find in that section, which I think is fantastic. The other really nice thing with the book is down here, I just turned to a basic page. This is the basic techniques section, and down here you have cross-references. So if there's something on a page that references material that gets delved into deeper elsewhere, the cross-reference is right down here. So you don't have to wonder where it is. It's not buried in a paragraph in the middle. You can always come down to the bottom of the page where the cross-references are and find more material. So I think the way this information, this book, is really well laid out. The other thing I really like about this book is that this book is not as comprehensive as some of the other books we'll discuss in terms of delving in deeper on the technical aspects of knitting, or as many sort of lesser known knitting techniques covered in this book as some of the other books we'll discuss later on. But every technique that is discussed in this book is discussed in depth and gives multiple examples. For example, in the basic section, binding off, it presents like 3 or 4 pages of different bind-offs. And these bind-offs really cover, I would say, most situations that you're in. So just buying this one book, you're gonna get plenty of bind-offs to try out. You're gonna get plenty of cast-ons, and it covers like the 5 basic cast-ons that I think every knitter needs to know, like the 5 categories of cast-ons. It has an example from all of those categories. Also, this book has something I think is so great and distinguishes it from some of the other books, is it has a stitch dictionary. I feel like a stitch dictionary can allow you to explore different stitch patterns in a very low stakes way, because you can just cast on a few stitches and practice a stitch pattern. And what's nice about this one is it's like a little, this book in terms of the stitch dictionary, it's kind of a little like taste, it's like a little appetizer buffet for you to kind of try out different things. Now, one of the nice things about this book is there are a lot of color photos in it, which I really appreciate, because I feel like color photos are just sometimes more pleasant to look at. But it's nice too because, for example, here's this section on increases, and you have very nice, clear, large illustrations in color for doing an increase, but it has the color photo right next to it as well, so that you can clearly see how that increase looks in real fabric. Not all of the knitting references books do that quite so well. This book is written in a very approachable way. It uses like generally uses language that we're used to, but it also uses knitting jargon that you generally find. Believe me, this is going to come up later in the video, okay? But I like that, and I like that it's written, on the one hand, this book is written a very approachable way. It's not personable, meaning this is not written from one knitter's point of view. This book is not going to have jokes in it. It does not have anecdotes in it. It's not going to talk about personal preferences. Like here on Holding Yarn and Needle, it says, watch other people knit, and you'll notice that everyone has a different way of holding the yarn and knitting needle. This is the most difficult thing to master when learning to knit, and it's important that you find a method that works for you. I like that it acknowledges that figuring out how to hold your needles and work with them is the hardest thing to master in knitting, and it is. But it also acknowledges that where you end up is a matter of personal preference. It doesn't tell you, well, this way is really the best way, and that way, it just sort of presents, here are some methods that you can try out. And I actually really appreciate that, especially for more beginning knitters, because a lot of times when we are first starting out in a craft and somebody shares their opinion with us about something, our tendency is to then take that as fact, when really it's just an opinion. So I do like that this book offers up different techniques without being opinionated or judgmental about it. The only drawback for me with knitting, Vogue knitting, is that I don't know if I would call it the ultimate knitting book. I don't know if I would call it that, because again, on a technical level, kind of delving deeper into the technical aspects of knitting, I think this is a first step along that road. I don't think it is the complete guide to that road. Next, we're going to look at actually the first knitting reference book I ever bought, which is this one. This is the Reader Digest Knitter's Handbook by Mott's Stanley. And I have to say, in sort of the knitting book, world lexicon, this is a classic book. You can also tell this book is much loved by me and much utilized by me by all of the little reference tags. I've got like sticky notes all over it. The organization of the book is very good. It follows a logical flow like Vogue knitting. You get your introduction, you get a nice section on how to knit a good gauge swatch. One of the nice things too about this book is as you go through the different information on it, it talks about sort of how to troubleshoot with things that come up. Like right here in Holding the Work, it talks about aches and pains, arm or hand cramps, stiff shoulders, headache, neck ache. If knitting gives you any of these, consult your doctor to make sure there's nothing seriously wrong with you. If there is not, the cause could well lie in the way you arrange yourself and use your muscles. So right off the bat, in the first 20-30 pages, it's talking about ergonomics in knitting. It actually, in this book, it talks about supported English knitting, meaning you holding the right needle under your arm in a knitting belt, which I appreciate that because you don't see that in a lot of knitting books talking about different ways you can hold your needle if you are a English style knitter or a thrower. It also talks about knitting in your left hand, and it talks about kind of the pros and cons of each of these approaches. And this is the book where I first learned about Portuguese style knitting, or when you tension the yarn around your neck. So this definitely is a comprehensive book that definitely taught me a lot of aspects of knitting that I was just unaware of until I started going through this book. It has a great section on aftercare. This book really taught me a lot in terms of how to take care of a hand knitted item and how to wash and block all of your work. One thing that's interesting though is it actually covers that topic near the beginning of the book and then says get to clicking and starts talking about choosing your cast on. So it's kind of interesting with this book how it arranges the information. It doesn't kind of take you from the standpoint of first you got to learn how to do your knit and stitches, then you learn how to have to pattern, then I'm going to teach you how to wash and block it. Instead kind of goes, let's look at this big picture and then we're going to narrow in. This reference book, if Vogue Knitting is kind of I think the ideal reference book in a lot of ways for a beginner knitter or an advanced beginner knitter, I feel like this reference book is really great for people who are either kind of advanced beginner wanting to move up into intermediate, or an intermediate knitter really wanting to deepen their knowledge about kind of the technical aspects of knitting. For example, this book talks about bias knitting. Bias knitting is when basically you knit and you force the rows, instead of going horizontally, they move along a diagonal. So it's more like a biased fabric. The way that you create biased fabric in knitting is with increases and decreases. And this book talks about that. And this is what I mean by comprehensive in terms of just sort of a technical aspect of knitting, where it's not just saying, here's how you this is how you do an increase or a decrease. This book shows you how you use increases and decreases to create different shapes in your knitting. And that's not something that Vogue Knitting book does quite as in depth as this book does. I swear, this is a book that every time I go into it, I'm like, oh wait, that information is in it? I forgot that's in there. But this book is so great, Carrie. And it is. It really is so good. What's the problem with it? Well, I think I read a review on Amazon that said that it read like a technical manual written by a drill sergeant, meaning there's a little bit more opinion in this book. I feel like Mont Stanley's voice is more present. Like, I feel her more in the room when I'm reading this book than I do with Vogue Knitting. I'll give you an example. Yarn in left hand, also called German or continental knitting, the last name should be discouraged as many European countries do not hold the work in this way. I don't disagree with Mont Stanley on that. I do not disagree with her on that. I just think it's a battle we're losing. Using circular or stranded needles just long enough to hold the work is a very fast method to knit, not so much to purl. Purl stitches, too large, see common problems above, are far from infrequent. I appreciate the honesty about the struggles of purling in continental. But it definitely is offering up not just like, you're going to have to figure out what you like best, here's how you do each one, the way that Vogue Knitting does. This is actually offers more like kind of pros and cons to the various methods that you can utilize when you're trying to figure out how to hold your needles. That's the thing about this book, though, that sometimes I'm a little like weary of, which is like, okay, it's really great for the technical information around the actual fabric and knitting, but when it's a little bit more like opinion or misunderstanding, you kind of got to know when you're looking at that. But yes, overall, I'm a big fan of this book. Yes, there's some things in there where I'm like, I disagree with you, Mont Stanley. I just disagree with you on that. But that's okay, because knitters can disagree and still respect one another. And I really have nothing but respect for this book. Again, I think this is an excellent book that if you are a more advanced beginner or intermediate knitter, I think this is a really excellent handbook. I think that maybe if you're more beginner, less confident knitter, this book can sometimes feel a little bit intimidating. I think that Vogue Knitting is a little bit more approachable, but still, I love this book. I love it. So the last book that we are going to review today is not in front of me. Well, it is. It's on my phone because I have this in ebook format, and that is Principles of Knitting by June Hemmett Hyatt. So of the three books, you know, I love Vogue Knitting. I love Reader's Digest Knitter's Handbook. Of the three, this is the book that I have sort of a respect-hate for. It's complicated. I have complicated feelings about this book and sort of complicated thoughts. So let's start with the positives of this book. Oh my God, is it comprehensive? Comprehensive. If there's a technique in knitting that exists that's not in this book, then it is a rare bird indeed. This book is the book that I learned about twined knitting, which is a technique where you use two strands of yarn and you twist the yarn in between each stitch, and it's very cool. It's a very cool technique, and I know how to do it, and I enjoy doing it. I don't do it often, but I enjoy doing it. I first heard about the concept of introduced cables in this book. So it covers all the things, and I'm really glad that I have it in e-format form because it is huge. It's not just a book, it's a tome to knitting. It is a knitting tome. To give you an idea, Knitter's Handbook is 300 to the index, 318 pages. This is a 318 page book. Vogue Knitting is, oh, I forgot that there's graph paper back here. With the graph paper is 280 pages. Principles of Knitting is 736 pages. So when I say that Principles of Knitting is comprehensive, it is comprehensive. And what I do really appreciate and kind of do love about Principles of Knitting is similar to Reader's Digest Knitter's Handbook, the Maud Stanley book, but in even more in-depth way, it does delve into more of the technical aspects of knitting. It doesn't just tell you, here's how you do the thing. It tells you, here's why you do the thing, here's what the thing will do, and this is how it all works together. This book, I do think, has like the best conversation and explanation on how to do a gauge swatch than any other book I've ever seen. Like, it does not like just pitter patter its way through it, and just that alone I kind of understand why Principles of Knitting is such a beloved piece by so many knitting teachers and knitting designers who really like value this book, and I get why. I totally get why. I think that for the everyday knitter, the average knitter, I think that this section, this paragraph sums up my problem with it. As you go through the book, you may encounter terms that are unfamiliar to you or which differ from those you have seen elsewhere. In doing the research, I found that identical techniques were often referred to by different names or symbols in different books, which is very true. This is one of the things that makes learning knitting tricky sometimes, is there is no academy. There's no Chicago style handbook that tells everybody this is what you should call it and how you should refer to it. There's different systems, different ways that people go about doing it. And hey there, Ed and Carrie here. So I want to insert myself now because I'm going to be honest, at the time that I recorded this review, my thoughts got a bit muddled and all over the place as I was sort of expressing my frustration with Principles of Knitting in terms of terminology that's used, or in some cases not used, in the book. So I figured I'll try to do it more succinctly now. I agree with June Hemmons Hyatt that one thing with knitting and learning how to knit is that there is no agreed upon set of terminology for every technique and every aspect of knitting. And her approach to that problem was to, in some cases, create her own terminology, or to use terminology that made sense to her. And sometimes she explains that she's using terms and what they stand for and why. She does that actually in her introduction. But oftentimes she just starts using or describing a technique without any reference to what is fairly well known common knitting vernacular. For example, Norwegian purl. I have the ebook version, right? If I search for Norwegian purl in Principles of Knitting, I get no search results for that because she never uses the term Norwegian purl. But Principles of Knitting does explain how to do a Norwegian purl. So I think there's just things in the book in terms of the terminology where she was trying to make things more clear or try to present things in a more standardized way that sort of erased any sort of cultural touchstone around the techniques that she's describing. And I think she did it in an effort to clarify and standardize how to discuss knitting, but I feel like, at least for an everyday knitter, does the opposite. It actually makes the book, in some instances, harder to use and find the information that you want, which I'm about to go into more detail now. Like, for example, when I was doing Master Hand Knitting book, I had to research how to properly wash and block fabric, your hand knits, right? And so I went looking in this book for washing and blocking. It took me forever to find it. She doesn't call the chapter on washing and blocking. She calls it cleansing and dressing. Now, maybe that's a common term in England, I don't know. But it's like cleansing and dressing a knit. A knitted fabric cannot be thought of as finished until it has been dressed. And she puts dressed in quotation marks, washed or dry cleaned, and then blocked and or steamed. If you've been on Twitter the last few weeks, you know there was a bit of a kerfluffle around blocking lace, and I just want to take this moment to say that I am only quoting the book. I shot this video a week before all that went down, and it is just a coincidence. Several methods can be used: cleaning, dry cleaning, laundry, including two things, pH. She goes in the pH level, by the way. This book is so extensive that when it comes to washing and drying, she talks about the pH level of the water and being able to adjust the pH balance of the water, which is great. And also, I don't think something I would ever do, but I'm glad I have the information. Nail polish remover, vinegar, water, detergent, enzymes, washing a knit. We finally got to washing a knit. Like all of these pages just to get to how to wash a knit. I think that sometimes with this book, when you're trying to find specific information or answer to something, it can feel a little difficult to find because the book is so dense and so wordy, so wordy that, and it uses so much non-standard sort of jargon and terminology that you start feeling a little bit frustrated with it. And even sometimes where you're like, well, I know generally this is where I should find information on, for example, blocking my knits. I go to that section and I still have to like flip through so many pages to try to get to it. So like I said, I have a love-hate with this book. I think that it's a book that definitely has its place. I'm really glad I have it, but I think it's definitely not a book that's for everybody. And I think that if it's one that you're interested in, I would definitely try to get it from your library first and go through it and see if it is for you. That would be my recommendation. My other recommendation would be to get it in the ebook format and not in the physical format. I think in the ebook format, it's a little easier at times to use the index and hyperlink to different sections that you're looking for, and kind of be able to click through, do a bookmark, write up notes, mark up that bitch, if you will. But it's not a book that I would recommend to everyday knitters, not by any stretch of the imagination. I'm glad I have it. I have utilized it. It has been worthwhile to me, but it is not for everybody. Like, Principles of Knitting is not for everybody. It's not. Now I'd love to hear from you. Do any of you have one of these books? What are your thoughts about it? Do any of these books interest you? What do you think about building your own knitting library? Are you like Pshaw? Pshaw? Everything on the internet is free. I have feelings about that. But anyway, I'd love to hear about it down in the comments below. I hope that you enjoyed today's video, and if so, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. Liking videos, sharing videos, commenting on videos, you can tell I say this in every video, are all great ways to let YouTube know that this is a space worth checking out that helps grow my channel, and it's a wonderful way to support a free way to support what I'm doing. Also, if you have not already, please make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. Clicking the bell will help ensure that you will get notified whenever I upload a new video or start a live stream. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy making. Bye. There's 3 that I'm going to talk about today. One is the Vogue knitting. There's 3 reference books that I'm going to talk about today. One is the Vogue Knitting Ultimate Knitting Book. The Ultimate Knitting Book. So there's 3 books that I'm going to discuss today. One is the Vogue Knitting, the Ultimate. Then we have the Reader's Digest Knitter's Handbook by Mont Stanley. So there's 3 books specifically that I'm going to talk about today. One is the Vogue Knitting Ultimate Knitting Book. Then there is the Reader's Digest. Oh, why can't I say this?